Hello, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards, and my co-host today, as always, is Jeremiah Vardaman.
How
Greetings,
you doing?
Jeremiah.
Doing
And in
good.
the background, who you cannot see is Jenny Thompson. Hello, Jenny. Oh, she's muted herself, so here we go already. Okay, so our guest today is Jenny Ingerson Neiman. She's the equine specialist at the University of Wyoming. Hello, Jenny. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having
Good.
me on today.
Yes, very happy to have you here. A couple of things that we need to go over before we get started. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, if you have a question or a comment, if you take your mouse and hover over your screen, there'll be a Q&A button or a chat button. You can use either of those and enter your question there. If you are following us on Facebook, please use the chat area in Facebook, or comment area, I guess I should say, and ask your questions, and we will bring those forward and get them to you, Jenny. So today, being the equine specialist, we are talking about horses. And so Jenny, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Jeremiah, did I forget anything today?
No, we're good.
Okay, all right.
We're ready to dive into the equine science.
So Jenny, if you would like to talk a little bit about yourself, how you ended up at the University of Wyoming, that we could start there, and then we can dive into the program.
Okay, so I'm the equine specialist here, and I also share my responsibilities between teaching here on campus and then extension, and particularly with the 4-H youth program. I actually grew up in eastern Nebraska. We were just talking about that with the ironic grass founder topic for today. We'll reach towards the end. And I have been here going on 6 years, and I am happy to be a part of University of Wyoming.
And we're glad to have you. You've been at least for me, you've been a fabulous resource reaching out. And so I just want to throw out there to everybody on our clients that if you got questions, bring it to us. And when we can tap down into our specialists and our faculty members like Jenny down on campus and get specific questions on specific topics answered. So yeah, today we're talking about horse nutrition though, correct?
Yes.
So why don't you go ahead and share your screen and we can get started. It looks like Jeff froze, so we'll let him figure that out and maybe he can join us here in a little bit.
Okay, we'll share this one.
Probably having that horse breathe over his shoulder.
Yeah,
Frozen.
It looked pretty good with that picture he had, didn't it?
Okay, let's go back.
So we can see your presenter mode, and that's fine. But if you can get it just to the
Let me switch
show mode.
For whatever reason it jumped over. So share this screen. Thank you for telling me that. There, is that better?
Yep, there it is. We're ready to roll.
All right, and so as we go along today, I encourage you type in your questions. We're happy to stop. This talk is more what I want you to get out of it. So ask questions as we go along. Please don't be afraid to interrupt. That's what we're here for today. And I'll try to do my best not to fumble through it too much. So, and I'm happy again to take questions.
Great. So where do we start with equine nutrition?
It is such a big topic. I kind of struggled narrowing it down for today. So today I focused really on the big concepts. And I'm a big fan of trying to keep it simple as possible. You can make rations really, really, really challenging. And some people really enjoy mathematically figuring out their rations for their horses. And some people want to keep it simple as possible. So I'm trying to do a blend here. So just jump in again if you want to take it one way or the other. So we're going to...
I'm a simple person. We go off of body conditioning and give them less, give them more kind of attitude and maybe supplement now and then. So that's kind of my focus on it, but it'll be interesting to hear kind of the more in-depth if I wanted to.
And we'll go across, and I kind of included some of the most common concepts and questions I get as a specialist here. So again, we'll start talking about general nutrition, and then we'll, towards the end, get into grass founder specifically.
Sorry,
Welcome back, Jeff.
There. Yeah, thanks.
You froze up really good with your picture. It was great.
Who knows if that's going to last?
So we'll talk about horses specifically. Like, they don't really they fit in a lot of different categories depending on how you define them, whether you define them as a pet or if you define them as a livestock. So that does change how we view them in our management and feeding strategies. So the horse is unique. Technically, Wyoming does define them as livestock. We're going to look at some of the challenges within the horse industry in feeding our horses. So some of the things we see are the age of our horses are increasing. And we see a picture here of a geriatric horse getting older and older. With more technology, better feed, better health care, our horses are living longer. And then we have a diversity of horses, whether it is a hunter under saddle or an Arabian or a draft horse. We have a big variety.
So diversity, now when you're saying diversity, are you meaning just the different of breeds coming out and just constantly expanding that way, or is it a difference in body structure in that, or are they all together?
I would say altogether diversity, because even within, I'll talk about the American Quarter Horse Association, the AQHA, they're the largest breed registry in the world. And within that, you have different kind of what I'm leading into the next one, the selection criteria is a lot different. So maybe if you're doing cutting with your horse, they're going to be a smaller, stockier build, like 14, 15 hands, versus doing some hunter jumper stuff where they're going to be 16 hands. And it's a big difference whether we're feeding a horse that's 14 hands or 16 hands in their muscle composition.
Right. And their use.
Yep, and their use, exactly. Are they a pet just in a lawn ornament, or are they getting heavily used every day?
Right.
And one of my favorite things to talk about with horses is the selection criteria is greatly varied. So maybe to me, I really want docility. I have young kids. So the biggest thing I'm going to focus on is getting a docile horse. Temperament's really important to me. And that maybe you're a barrel racer and you want to have some speed. And then also a difference with the horses and some of our livestock, like we are not selecting them on weaning weight, on milk production, on carcass yield. So it could be what color you want your horse to be or how fast you want it to be.
Yeah, just all those different criteria that we're interested in horses, right? We own horses, myself, my wife, and I, and yeah, we see that all over the board. And of course, you have the ones that I just want something pretty, right? I just want it to look good out in the pasture. Beyond that, I don't care. Some want a certain personality, right? They like horses with a lot of personality or not as much. No, it's all over the board and it's different. But that plays into feeding though and nutrition.
Yep, depending on your temperament's going to be a lot different. If you want a horse that's going to go fast all day long, the disposition of your horse, just like related to kind of cattle in the feedlot, are more nervous horses are going to have a harder time maintaining weight. Typically because, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, there's some stereotypies, or we commonly call them vices with our horses, like cribbing or stall weaving or those kind of stereotypies. Those behaviors will actually change.
Okay, what do you,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
can you explain cribbing?
Cribbing would be...
For those of us who might not know that.
Cribbing, if you drove along a fence line, let's say, and you see a horse with its front teeth on the fence post and it's pulling back.
Okay.
That's a
doing on stalls, metal, wood.
Chewing on the top rail of something.
Yep.
And the behavior itself is actually not just chewing, but it's hooking the teeth and inducing a mechanism within the brain that releases an endorphin.
Oh,
So
it makes me feel good. So let's do it. Let's keep doing it.
You're exactly right. Let's keep doing it more and more. And it's known as like a stress coping mechanism in a horse.
So it would be a soothing mechanism, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And usually can be associated with boredom, correct? So those high energy horses that you were talking about with that selection category, right? Maybe our performance horses or just are a nervous horse anyway. They're going to go to that cribbing in boredom or in a stressful time period.
And actually, the irony coming up again here, we're talking about nutrition. The number one link to these vices or stereotypes in horses is primarily nutrition based.
So,
Wow.
so if they are receiving the proper nutrition that they need, this type of behavior wouldn't start, or they wouldn't do that, or is that correct?
It is less likely. The
Less
research isn't clear cut, like do X, Y, and Z and you won't see this. But we were talking a little bit before the show, and as Jeremiah mentioned, of some young race horses or young performance horses, like a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, they're trying really hard to physically meet their own growth, dietary requirements, and then also the hard physical output, the physical strain on their body. And to feed them enough adequately, we're going to have a hard time meeting the big volume of roughage that a horse would normally see. Because we're going to try to lean over. I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is perfect, though.
We can get ahead and then come back again. It's okay.
Yeah. We're going to lean on our concentrate to get our calories up, because there's less calories in a roughage than there is in a concentrate. So they're going to have to eat a lot of concentrate to maintain their weight and their muscle. So then we start seeing some stress signs to the nutritional physiology of the horse without having enough roughage. Kind of in the cattle industry, they would say kind of a scratch factor.
Okay.
And so that's some of the diversity we're going to see in a herd, right? So if I have multiple horses out there, I might have one horse I'm struggling to keep weight on and another horse that I don't have any problem keeping weight on, right? And that might be just that selection criteria at play there, their personality, if you will, or their temperament.
And genetically, we don't have a link to easy keepers and hard keepers. So if I have a horse that's a hard keeper, but I really, really, really like this horse, it's fast, it's big, it's docile, whatever I want out of it, I'm going to keep producing out of that bloodline. So I'm going to keep propagating those genetics regardless of being an easy keeper or a hard keeper.
Right. So the next point you have there is economic demand and or value. What do you mean by that?
So we're coming on harder times here, especially with COVID and everybody trying to keep a job, maintain a job, feed their animals, right? And rebounding still from our economy about, I think, 2016, 2017, specifically here in Wyoming. And this is kind of twofold. Can you afford to feed them as well as you would like? And then also, if I feed them at the level I would like to, am I going to get that money back out of them?
And that's different for every person in every situation and every horse, right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, and horses, they're not a cheap investment. They're not a cheap hobby. That's before you get into the vet bills, right? So.
Exactly. And I'll kind of look at the next one with where do they fit in our economy? And then moving to a lot of us horse owners in general, since they walk the line of being a pet or livestock, are we willing to experiment with them with our nutritional research studies? Not very often. It's pretty hard to get a horse owner to willingly sign their horse up to experiment with them.
Right. Right. To explore how better to take care of them or what not to do. Yep.
Yeah. And it's really hard to get their cecum, get them cecally cannulated or different types of cannula. So it would be basically like a cattle with a rumen. The surgery is harder on horses than it is on cattle in general. So we have a harder time getting a successful herd to do these. Even if they are willing to experiment, it's getting harder to successfully have the horse accept the fistula or the cannula.
So you're just saying it's harder to do research on nutrition and changing nutrition and things to see how it affects horses because of their physiology.
Yep.
Great.
So I do know what a cannula is, but there may be listeners who don't, or watchers who don't. So can you explain that a little bit better?
I'm struggling. I said that and I went, how do I really explain that?
Well, in cattle, and they use it in horses, but it's a device that is used for sampling into an animal. So into our livestock, it can be installed into cattle or into horses, and they put it into their digestive tract at a certain location, may it be in the stomach or the ceca for the horse, or the different parts of the stomach in the cattle. So as they're doing nutritional research, they can sample or biopsy those different portions of that nutrition going through. So it's a window or a conduit for you to sample internal into the digestive tract.
I think of it as a window into the animal, right?
Yeah. Hopefully I didn't butcher that too bad, Jenny.
It's
No,
an access port.
Great.
Access port for sampling.
There you go. Yeah, perfect. So about increased use of supplements, minerals, vitamins, lubricants, fats, and then horses don't read books. What are you getting at there with those two topics?
Those two, there's a lot of different supplements or a mineral or a vitamin or a lubricant or some kind of fats, whether it is corn oil or something along those lines. There's not really a lot of research on efficacy of them or if they really work. And a lot of our supplements in general are not FDA regulated in the horse industry. So we have some effects that we don't really know what's going on. If we feed a bunch of this, we don't know what it does to this. So we don't have a lot of information about those, but they're very, very popular to be used to grow the mane, grow the tail, get a shinier coat, a healthier hoof. So they're very popular, but we don't necessarily know exactly how they work or how they would interact with parts of the nutrition of the horse.
Right.
And the last part is one of my favorite ones. I grew up with this. I heard this all the time. The horses don't read books. We had a broodmare farm. And talking on the reproduction side, like the horse would cycle and they're supposed to maybe ovulate on a certain day so you could breed them, and they wouldn't. Right? And then on the nutrition side, you have one horse, you may have horses that are exactly the same height, same color, same weight. One keeps weight easy and the other one does not. So there's a lot of variation because we haven't selected them specifically for feed efficiency or milk production along those lines too. We have a lot of genetic variation and a lot of individuality with horses.
Which makes it challenging, or could be challenging, once you hit nutrition.
Exactly.
Great. What's next?
Okay. So we'll kind of talk about the nutritional physiology, and I put just a picture up here out of the horse industry handbook, which I do highly recommend if you're looking for a resource. It's from the American Youth Horse Council. And this just kind of shows a picture of our digestive system. The one thing I really would change is that the digestive system actually does start up here in their mouth.
That makes sense.
That's a suggestion for the next revision of the manual, correct?
Yep, and they have whole sections on dental care, so maybe they didn't feel it was adequate to put it in here. But this picture shows how immensely long and almost crammed, I would say, the nutritional physiology is of the horse. And when we look at how they evolved, right, they evolved on the plains, and their physiology is directly linked to their eating behavior and how they evolved. So they evolved on the plains to constantly move and constantly graze with a slow rate of passage. They're not like a ruminant that eats a lot, lays down in the shade, and then will ruminate their feed. And the horse will have to digest all day long as it goes. And if we think about the horse, how did they survive? Was by running fast.
So hold on a second now, Jenny. When you're saying ruminant, right? So we might have some people that are not as familiar with the ruminant digestive system. How is that different? When you say a cow goes and gets, filled up on grass or whatever their forage is, and then goes and beds and ruminates, what does that really mean? And how is that different than a horse?
That, and you can help me out here if I don't say it correct enough for our ruminant physiology, that they will lay down, they'll have the food in their stomach, and then they'll regurgitate it, chew it, like a flow of digesta. They'll chew it and then swallow it again. And they'll repeat that process, and then it will eventually flow through their digestive tract.
So they have the ability to to masticate and grind that forage even finer when they're ruminating, and they're working that cut again and then swallowing it again for it to be broke down further, so more nutrients are extracted from that same mouthful, so to speak. But horses, now, can they regurgitate and chew their cud?
No, the horse actually cannot vomit. There is a sphincter that stops the horse from vomiting. So this is actually a really important part, and why a horse can get so sick if they open up the barn door or you leave it open and they go get into the feed room and they decide to eat half a bag of sweet feed.
It's like having the kids in the candy store, right? Just
yeah,
turn them loose and they get sick. But with a horse, it's actually lethal, or could be lethal.
Life-threatening.
Yeah.
There's no way to give them, I forget what it is for children, to make them throw up. Once they ingest it, the horse cannot vomit. So it has to make its way through the...
I think that's syrup of ipecac.
Sounds like you've had it before.
I know what it is.
So you're saying the sphincter, and the sphincter is just a muscle that closes down throughout the digestive system to keep that nutrition moving forward, right? Making that food not come back the wrong direction. And with horses, it's a really strong sphincter, so they cannot regurgitate, they can't vomit, anything like that. And that's where we get into colic issues or twisted gut, correct?
Yep, and along with that's exactly correct. And the physiology, like the rumen is very large in the cow, and that's where they're gonna have microbes or bugs that help digest some of that really, really tough forage. And this relates to the physiology on why we have the terms of cattle hay and horse hay. That a ruminant, is a lot easier or able to digest some of our poorer quality because of the cecum and being able to ruminate, versus a horse. The horse does have a cecum, which we see down here, that does have the microbial population, the bugs to help digest the roughage, but it's small in comparison to the cow. And we, again, don't have the ability to go back and forth with chewing and further digesting it at the mouth.
So it needs a higher quality roughage in comparison, right, to come through that animal, so it can extract those nutrients. And it doesn't spend as much time in the horse as it would in a cow because of that longer, stretched out, more constant moving digestive tract.
Yep, and relating it back to how they evolved with, they had to be able to run fast at a moment's notice to escape a predator. And they couldn't have a very large load of feed in their system and run fast. And I think we all might be able to relate to that after you go to the buffet or whatever it may be, or Thanksgiving dinner. The last thing you want to do is go outside and run around the block.
Yeah, if something came in and scared me during Christmas dinner, I'm not moving. It's not happening.
You would try to blend in, wouldn't you, Jeremiah? You can't see me. I'm not here.
Definitely. Great. So how do we, now we've basically taken this horse out of that environment for the most part in the domestication, right? And so has that changed, or how does that change our management of that animal through a nutritional perspective?
And it has changed significantly, and we do our best to try to meet their nutritional physiology. But when we understand the nutritional physiology, we can better manage and feed our horses and kind of understand where the problems might come up. And we talked a lot about like keeping a horse in captivity, whether it's a dry lot or a stall. So a lot of the times we may not be able to, not everybody owns enough acreage to turn their horses out. And we manage them in a confined situation. So some of the best things we try to do is feed them small meals multiple times a day. So if it's possible to go out and feed your horse 3 times a day, and we want to be consistent on when we feed them. When we introduce feedstuffs, we do have a pH change in the digestive tract, and that can affect, just like in cattle, it can affect horses too, the overall health of the horse. We hear the topic of gastric ulcers, which are ulcers in the stomach a lot. And those are caused by a change in pH. Some of that change in pH is related to their feed. It's not only to how we feed them, it's also, as we talked a little bit earlier, about stress levels in the horse. And our high stress horses kind of have a double whammy because maybe they're in a high stress training situation of being a 2 or 3-year-old going to the cutting fraternity or on the racetrack. And then also we have changed our ration or feed for that horse to be a pretty high concentrate and a lower roughage. And when they eat more hay, it stimulates the digestive tract to help keep it less acidic.
So it buffers that pH in the digestive tract.
Yep.
And that's why we want, one reason why we want a lot of roughage in our horse's diet.
So
Okay.
some techniques, some people will leave a round bell out there for them to chew on all day, which can be good on their nutritional physiology, but maybe not so good on their physique.
Yeah, the big old grass bellies, right? Especially those geldings that look like pregnant mares walking around, right? Yep.
So it kind of depends on your end goal and what you're going for with your horse. But the more we can feed them small meals multiple times a day, we help match that physiology the best we can, and trying to be consistent on when we feed them and not, I always think about a lot of our college students who are sleeping in till 10 or 11 and on the weekends, and their horse doesn't get fed till late, and then during the week they're fed early in the morning. So we want to try to keep their pH also consistent as much as we can throughout the day.
Right. Don't want to have those big peaks and valleys in food availability, and then within that pH of that stomach will follow suit, so to speak. Yeah. Interesting. Well, so I'm just reading your slide here, and you have dental care. Like, why does that matter? Right. And at least for me, and I kind of jokingly giggle at that or whatever, but that's one of the big things that I see in horse owners that they don't pay attention to, especially in terms of a nutritional context. And a lot of times, if you're having troubles keeping weight on a horse, it could be just that simple as getting their teeth taken care of, floated, could correct that behavior or that issue that you're having with a horse.
And I'll try to keep it pretty simple because we could spend an entire hour on dental care. The horse evolved to have relatively fast growing teeth because they constantly ate. And that would give more regular wear to their teeth. And when we have irregular wear to the teeth with an irregular diet, which we see now, we can cause, they're called hooks or pins, and they're sharp points on the horse's teeth that they chew in a circle. In general, when they chew, they don't chew up and down, so they wear like this, and they can get a hook on one side or on the bottom where the tooth gets longer, and that tooth might actually make a sore on their cheek, or it can poke up on the roof of their mouth or the bottom of their mouth, and that physically hurts to eat. So they can stop eating, or if anybody has seen a horse turn its head sideways to try to eat, to move away from the pain so they can still chew.
Well, and it can just, if it gets bad enough, it can cause abscesses within the mouth that can potentially get infected, and you don't want to go down that road. And it just means less intake on that animal and less nutrition into that horse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We are missing the breakdown of chewing, the physical. They don't regurgitate to chew over and over and over again. They get one shot to chew. And if they have a problem chewing, we're going to have less breakdown of the feedstuffs before it enters the digestive tract. So in general, they're going to recommend once a year that you have your horse's teeth checked. And between being, we'll say a young horse up to about 5, that you check about every 6 months, because their growth is happening so rapidly when they're getting their teeth. A mature horse typically gets their stock type horse is going to have all their teeth around 5 years old.
And is that a service that vets offer, or is it somebody else? Is it a horse?
A neighbor?
Horse dentist.
And that's actually quite a hot topic right now in the equine industry, a regulation of equine dentistry, because typically they're having to sedate the horse in order to float their teeth, which means they're taking a rasp and physically filing the horse's teeth, which is not enjoyable, you can imagine.
I can imagine.
So administering sedation is typically limited to veterinarians, but it will vary state by state on what your law requires for somebody to administer sedation to a horse.
So if they have to be sedated, this isn't something they can do in the field, right? Do they have to be taken in?
That's a really good question. It probably depends on your horse. If you have them halter broke and you can catch them, then you can, and depending if how much they've been handled, they can sedate them with just giving them a shot in the jugular, and it has to be IV in the jugular, in the vein, which is hard and it takes skill and practice, and it can be very, very detrimental to the horse if you miss. So having a vet do it, or a very skilled person, is very important. And if you have maybe a herd of wild horses, or I'm trying to think of a scenario along those lines, you might have to put them in a chute.
Okay.
Yeah, a horse maybe that isn't halter broke or isn't well handled, probably needs to be in a chute. But
So
before
that means your neighbor couldn't do it for you.
No,
usually not.
probably not, unless they happen to be a vet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one quick question before we move on, Jenny. For an equine dentist, is there a certification process that I should know about or ask for to know that they have specific training on floating teeth or anything that way?
And again, this is a hot topic again. My personal opinion would be to go with a veterinarian. You know that they've had the training to administer safely those the drugs, and then also they've had the experience with floating the horse's teeth.
Yeah, great. So what's next then? Let's get on, get a little further into actually feeding the animal and how do I balance this nutrient?
So when we look at feeding our horses, we want to look at, like, what do we typically feed them? We feed them, as we've been saying this terminology quite a bit. So forage or roughage, some type of hay, we want that to be the majority of the diet for all of the nutritional physiology and evolutionary behavior we've talked about. A general rule of thumb when we feed our horses, we want their diet, the whole thing, the diet, everything they eat, to be made up of a minimum of 1% to 1.5% of their body weight.
Is that per day?
Yes, per day.
Okay.
You want them to eat 1 to 1.5% of their body weight per day. That's probably why they got some of their nickname, right? Hay burners.
Hay burner. That's what came to mind.
Right. So I'm thinking the body weight of a horse. Like if I can estimate my body weight of a horse at 1,000 pounds, right? 1% of that is 10 pounds, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully I did the math right. And so we're looking at 10 to 15 pounds of forage, or of their total intake, correct?
Yep, and that's pretty low. That is a minimum maintenance.
Okay. So I don't want to shoot for that, right?
Typically you're going to be a little bit higher, and it depends a lot here on what you're doing with your horse too. What kind of needs and requirements does that horse have? If they're really an easy keeper, then maybe we would be fine along the lines of the 1.5%. If you're feeding a high, and it's going to depend a lot. That's a great question, Jeremiah. On the quality of your hay.
Okay.
Is it a really high quality, high nutrient hay?
So we're talking like getting into alfalfas, or a mixed hay that has alfalfa or a legume component in it that has a lot of nutrient component in it, a lot of crude protein, versus maybe just straight grass, or maybe a mature grass hay that's real stemmy, coarse, and not as much nutrient content within.
Yep.
So Jenny, I know that we've already talked that there's high variability between feeding animals, but is there a percentage of protein that you're looking for in the feed? Is that or does it vary between animals?
That's a really great question too, because it varies on what you're doing with the animal and also heavily on their age. There's a lot of factors. I'm going to focus on those two. On the age, are they growing? Is going to be a higher percentage of crude protein specifically that we're going to need with a younger horse, depending if it's weanling, yearling, 2 or 3 year old. And then on top of that, what kind of exercise or activities are we doing with them? So are they heavily used? They're going to need a higher percent of crude protein. Kind of your average maintenance horse is going to sit somewhere around the 7% crude protein requirement. And typically a good quality grass hay is going to sit around that 7%. I highly, highly suggest that you get your hay tested every time you get a new load so that you know what you're getting, because it could be your first cutting, second cutting, third cutting, depending.
They're all going to be different.
Yep, and depending where it came from. Did it come from South Dakota? Did it come from Kentucky? Did it come from Wheatland, Wyoming?
Yeah, or a new buyer, right, within the same area, right? I might have bought hay from 3 different hay brokers or producers here in Powell, and they could be different fields, differently managed, different grasses in that hay bale. Yeah, totally.
That's a really great question.
It's a tough one. That's why horse nutrition isn't the easiest, right? There's so many variables, so many factors. But maybe to give us an idea or a snapshot, and I'm going to put you on the spot, Jenny. But so my horse, he's turning 3, so he's a 3-year-old horse this summer. I'm starting to get him under saddle and starting to work him. If I'm lucky, I might get 2 or 3 rides on him a week, right? And each ride's maybe an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. What are we thinking crude protein wise, nutrient wise?
And a 3-year-old, I'm assuming it's a stock type quarter horse, and I'm going to assume that it's also relatively a smaller build.
Yep.
Maybe amongst the.
Yeah, he's a short, stocky guy.
And this even goes into, okay, what are the bloodlines with it? So exactly. And,
right.
Oh, for your 3 or 4-year-old, I tend to err a little on the higher side, but safely. So somewhere around a 12 to 14% crude protein is what I would go for with that horse. And that would be a balance amongst my roughage and my concentrate. And I think the horse industry does a really nice job, and it's very user-friendly when you go to the feed store, that they have wonderful labeling and pictures on the feed bag that it's for whatever development stage of a horse.
Is the crude protein content, is it additive then? So if you have roughage or if you have other things that you're adding to it, it would be so let's say the grass hay is 7% crude protein and you have a supplement that's 10%. It's an additive type effect, correct?
Yep, it would be additive, and you'd have to measure how much are you feeding of each one and kind of balance a ration. That's where you do get into balancing the ration, and a lot of producers and owners don't even go that far as to actually balance it. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and look at our next part of actually feeding. I think this is a very sound management strategy, is feeding to a body condition score.
Before we get there, Jenny, we had a question come in that asks, where do you go to get your hay tested to see how much crude protein or other things it has in it?
There's several options with our local extension agents. You can start with them. That would be my suggestion, is to talk to your local extension agent.
That's a great suggestion. Yeah, so you have local resources there. When folks come into me, I recommend that they send off their hay sample to an agriculture laboratory, because they're dealing in those analysis on a regular basis, and that's what you're going to want to look for. So I point folks to there's multiple of them out there, but the two that I normally are working with is Colorado State University Plant and Soil Laboratory. That is out of the university down there in Fort Collins. The other one is Ward Labs. Those are the two that I have primarily dealt with, but there are others. And I think, Jenny, you probably have a link to that on the Barnyards and Backyards website.
And Jeremiah, don't you have a probe available that folks can check out and plunge into their hay bales basically, and then use that as the sample mechanism.
Right. Yeah. So we do have a hay core in our offices. I'm not sure if there's one in every office in the state, but definitely ask for it. It definitely helps with sampling that hay, and it augers into the bale, into the middle of the bale, so you get a good representative sample of that hay bale before to send off. So it's a little better than just teasing apart a little hay and sending out a handful.
So that you can mail your sample into the labs usually, correct?
Correct. Yep. So you mail that sample into the lab, and then they in return, after the analysis is ran, they will email you or mail you a PDF or a document of the analysis of that. And then you can go from there with your local vet or someone like Jenny and try and balance those rations.
Jeremiah, do you know how much it costs to get a hay analysis completed?
Oh, it's not much. I can't remember. I want to say around $12 or $15 a sample. So it's reasonable. And you don't have to sample every bale, right? So you could take, if you get a ton of hay in, which for small squares, let's say it's 30 bales, you could sample, roughly 10 of those, put them in a bag, mix it up, send it off, and you'd have a representation for the whole stack that you just had.
Right.
Yeah, great questions. So let's go to body score.
We're going to talk about the Henneke body condition scoring. This is kind of the go-to in the horse world. And when we look at body condition scoring, it's not based on what they weigh, right? Because how hard is it for a producer or owner to even walk their horse across a scale? We do have some weight tapes that you can get from a local feed store. I don't know if they're at the extension offices, but typically in a local feed store, they can get a weight tape for you. But
yeah, I don't have one in my office. Let's go that way.
I have a few. We use them for teaching purposes here to give you an estimate of their weight. It goes around the barrel. So typically right behind the withers and then around the barrel of the horse, you would use a weight tape here. But how many people own one of those? How many own a scale? So an easier way that everybody can do, and this is actually really, really commonly used in welfare cases in the horse, is they're going to assess the body condition score, which is actually rated on the amount of fat that the horse has. And I really emphasize actual palpation, so actually touching your horse, going out there and touching them and looking at them both. It's a really big difference in the winter with a long hair coat.
You have that fuzzy horse out there. It's really hard to assess how much of that is fluff and how much is really the fat underneath that fluff.
And the scoring system is based on the stock type, about 1,000-pound horse, kind of your average build like that. So there will be some variation, like we have some halflingers here on campus that don't quite fit the mold, but in general, this is the go-to for how to feed your horse and a lot of welfare issues. Whether it's too thin or more and more as we see obesity, we kind of kill them with kindness. And we're going to have our range. I'm going to touch lightly on this. And we can share again, I think Jenny, and we were talking about this earlier, a file on this for more detail. The range is 1 to 9, 1 being so thin that they're emaciated, they're gonna fall over any second. And then 9 being so fat, it's actually kind of hard to find a picture of a 9. I mean, their back actually goes down, they can catch rainwater in it everywhere, they move, they jiggle. Okay? And our ideal is gonna be somewhere in the middle, being a 5 to a 6.
So are you usually feeling over like the rib kind of area? So you're trying to feel like how much fat is covering the ribs?
Thank you for that. And this diagram here typically shows you where you're going to touch to feel some of the fat along the neck, along the withers, along the ribs. Are they sticking out? Are they completely covered? If you press really hard on the ribs, can you even touch them? Or are you pushing really hard and all you feel is fat still? Right behind the shoulder and the tail head, kind of along here with our hip conformation. And you do have to be careful with a little bit of differences along the neck. Like if they're a draft horse, they just are going to be a little crusty in their neck, or even a stallion. That's going to be a sex or breed characteristic that differs in Mangum.
So as I've been around the horse world, I guess you could call it. I've always heard that, well, you know, a horse is in good physical condition and a good nutrition level if you can see the back 3 ribs. What are your thoughts on that?
For the most part, it kind of depends what you're doing with them. That's
Right?
always the answer with horses, right? Because they don't read books.
Perfect extension answer. It depends.
Well, and it does. Because there's so many variables and so many factors to it. What time of year is it? Is the horse being exercised? What type of, is it in a confinement or a stall or a dry lot? Is it out to pasture? So there's so many factors playing into that one specific question.
And seeing ribs in general is you want to faintly see their ribs and faintly feel their ribs so that they're not obese. When we get into obese horses, or even undernutrition, I'm going to talk about obesity here for a second, we start to get some of our insulin resistance, and we start having some problems feeding this horse and managing them, especially turning out to grass. Obesity is not a good thing to kill them with kindness either. We start predisposing them to health conditions.
So when you say insulin deficiency, is that like a diabetes almost within the horse?
Yep, pretty similar, and they have different types of Cushing's disease. And once you start getting into those, then you're going to have to work with a veterinarian. You're going to have to work with a nutritional consultant, and have to do some pretty special management to feed that horse safely.
Great. So do you have some photos to show us of the body condition scoring?
Yep. And as we kind of go down and we talk about, before I flip to the specific pictures, I want to think about weight. We tend to underestimate how much our horse weighs. And so you're getting ready maybe perhaps for your county fair now, or whatever state fair or whatever event you may be looking forward to going to. If your horse is a little thin coming off a pasture, or a little heavy from maybe overfeeding them this winter, that change from one body condition score to the other is 100 to 165 pounds.
Oh, wow. So it's a significant drop in weight to get from one score to the next.
Yep, either drop or increase, exactly. So we want to have plenty of time to do that so that we don't stress their system and cause ulcers or other health problems as we go along. So in general, it takes a long time to change them safely, even though we might be like, oh, well, they're really fat. It'd be a great thing to cut them back to 1 flake a day. We're kind of not paying attention to their physiology, and we're going to have to change them slowly. So it's going to take you about 8 weeks to increase the body condition score safely. And I'd give you maybe 6 weeks to decrease. You can go down a little bit easier than you can go up. But in general, for either direction, I'm going to recommend an 8-week change.
Okay.
So here's a couple pictures here. This actually is from Mississippi State, and it's the Henneke body condition and scoring, and some wonderful pictures, as you see, from 1 being poor all the way up to our 9. We actually do have a picture here. We don't even have a picture of a 1. They're pretty hard to find because they're not going to live very long.
Basically, you just start seeing a lot of the skeletal structure through that at a 1, right? They're just a walking skeleton at that point. Is that a fair assessment?
Yep, and that's exactly the words I would use to describe it. And we didn't talk about this before the show, so I like that you said that.
Well, so now I'm looking, I want to have my horse somewhere between a 4, maybe a 5 or 6, just depending on what I'm doing with it. That's good because all my horses are a 5. Totally.
Sure.
Yeah.
The 4 is going to fall in where we want some lean athletes. When you have some high performing athletic horses, really like on the lean side, but you can get too lean. If you get too lean and you start dropping below the 4, that they're actually going to start breaking down their own muscle. They don't have enough fat reserves for the energy to perform, and they'll start breaking down their own muscle in order to get that caloric need, and that's going to be detrimental to their performance.
And so that could be any horse in use, really, right? Like, so rodeo horses, right? May it be barrel horses, roping horses. It could even be just a ranch horse, right? So it doesn't matter what use you're using them for, you want to not drop below that 4. Is that correct?
Yep. And some
And
horses just don't perform well at a 4.
they
There's
do
our
better at a 5.
Yeah, there's our individuals again. And when we have a mare going into foaling, let's say, or a horse going into a stallion going into breeding season, or a horse that you're getting ready to really be competitive on, maybe our 5 to a 6 is going to be better because you know they're going to lose some weight. And managing them can be a little harder, especially our mares going into foaling and then lactation. We're going to push them to be more around a 6 so that we have adequate energy for milk production.
How about for breeding? Like right before I breed that mare, where do I want her in a body conditioning? Do I want to already be up at a 6 to try and take on that pregnancy and move forward, or is that too much?
I was going to say between a 5 and a 6, and this is one of my favorite questions because a lot of us think, well, I have my mare is kind of fat and I'm sending her to the breeding barn and maybe she's sitting around an 8 or a 7, let's say, and we get to the breeding barn and we think, well, I better drop some weight on her while she's there. That's a really bad idea.
So we want to keep that body condition scoring up so that it helps with the body, the hormones, everything like that. So it's ease of pregnancy, maybe better at catching, better at conception, that kind of thing, and then keeping that fetus, correct?
Yeah, we don't want to enter a negative energy state when we're trying to breed the mare. And there's always going to be an exception. And when you get to the 8 to a 9, that's when I would start calling in a nutritional consultant and a veterinarian and trying to work with the both of them how to best manage the mare, because being too far on the obese side will decrease fertility. And then you have a double whammy of a negative energy balance that can decrease your fertility also. Right.
Okay. And so with other performance horses, I'm just trying to think this through. Like, so my horse is not a performance horse. I just don't have the time. I'd love to be out riding my horse every day. I think every horse owner dreams of that lifestyle, right? Being rich enough to have our own riding arena, have our indoor arena, and go ride every day. Unfortunately for me, that's not practical. But so my horses tend to be on the heavier side anyway. And I just don't get them enough exercise. But I'm trying to comparison that, right, of my horses out in the pasture. I ride them once or twice a week, the scenario I gave you with my 3-year-old. And now what if we flip that scenario on a nutritional standpoint to a race horse, right? Let's say a 3-year-old horse, same horse as mine, but a 3-year-old, and he's on the racetrack, but he's working out 4, 5, 6 hours a day and 6 days a week. What does that do to him?
That is a really, really hard nutritional demand, because not only are we going to we need to be sure that we're meeting the growth requirements so that he's not stunted in his growth or doesn't have any kind of predisposition to having arthritis with his bones growing and the growth plates growing adequately. How much pressure are we putting on that growth system? Not only do we need to meet that so he grows correctly, we need to meet the energy needs, like the difference between what a marathoner would eat versus a couch potato. So we have their growth requirement and then also their performance or energy requirement for being active. And then another one, so 3 different factors. Typically, we're going to have a relatively high stress environment for our horses that are high performance young horses.
Okay. And so that just increases the demand of the nutrition essentially. So if I'm in any situation, right, and I'm not keeping weight on a horse, maybe they're at a 4 and dropping to a 3 on me, whatever the scenario is, what can I do differently nutritionally to try and bring them up?
More calories.
Okay. So better quality forage going in. So maybe I'm switching from a grass hay to a mix hay, or if I'm on a mix hay, maybe mix hay and including more alfalfa in that roughage. Is that your recommendation?
I would, with your young performance horses, this is always a hot topic too. we're going to have to balance our roughage and our concentrate. They cannot physically eat enough roughage in this high stakes scenario that we're talking about. They can't physically eat enough roughage to meet that caloric need. So we're going to have to try to balance as much as we can, as much concentrate, because it's higher in calories. And I'm being oversimplifying. I'm not talking about vitamins and minerals and fats and protein. I'm going to say that we meet the calories that this horse needs. And then also we can't ignore that physiology of the horse, that they need a high roughage diet to maintain a healthy digestive tract, and less likely to have ulcers and colic and even laminitis, what we're going to talk about later. So that's a really hard scenario to get them to eat. I would put the calories up, and then I'm going to tell you to feed them multiple times throughout the day, as many small feedings to safely deliver it.
Great.
So
Well, let's move on then.
Jenny,
Sorry,
so
Jenny.
you talked about doing this slowly, right? You know, rapid changes in diets are going to cause problems. And then you talked about 8 weeks. So if you're making these changes slowly and then you carry it on for 8 weeks, would you suggest that's a good time to like reevaluate and see whether your change is working in the way you want? Or what kind of time frame are we talking about?
A good thing you can do, whether you're a horse owner or maybe you're running a business or an operation, a very good thing is to do pictures, because our eyes kind of see what they want to see a lot. And if we did it, I would say once a week or every other week, even in this type of a scenario, to assess with your own eyes and then also take a picture. And I highly recommend this for boarding facilities. Anybody who's kind of dealing with client horses is to regularly take pictures of them.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, to help you assess, like,
right.
What do they come in at? What do they want to go out at? Are we maintaining them during their training?
That's why all my horses are 5s, Jeff, is because I only see what I want to see.
Yep. I've also got your nutrition and exercise thing worked out for you too. I think you just need to ride them to work.
Yeah. You know, I almost thought about that with this COVID stuff going on. I was like, man, I'm not leaving the office to go visit clientele. Maybe I should just ride my horse to work, but it just never came together.
Those photos are a good idea. We suggest that when people are monitoring their pastures and stuff, they take photos, because it's hard to keep track sometimes how things are changing.
No, this is great. So what's next then, Jenny? Okay, we got our body conditioning down. Now what do we need to think about?
And we've been kind of addressing this as we've gone along the whole time, but there's a lot of different factors with our horses, whether it's within the horse industry or the horse themselves. We talked about some of the management guidelines. So what are their size or body type or weight? So we have a picture here of a really big difference between feeding a Clydesdale here versus a kid's pony. They may not have that difference when it comes to what their protein is that they need or don't need.
Because that's on a percent of their body, right? Or
Yep.
body weight, right?
Yep, so it goes back to what percent of their body weight are we going to feed them. And then also their age and production stage, what are we using them for in production stage? Not only like, are they an open mare? Are they a brood mare? Are they lactating? When we come down to temperament and stereotypies again, a horse that is, we'll say a stall weaver, which means they kind of have a stereotypy is a repetitive behavior that has no function. It serves no purpose, it serves no function.
So pawing, cribbing,
pawing, stall weaving, but specifically stall weaving is going to be a repetitive motion back and forth. It takes energy to move the body. So those horses that tend to pace or stall weave, they're going to burn a lot of energy moving a lot. The nervous horses are going to burn more energy.
Just unsettled.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay.
We'll look at fat insulation. So what are they currently at a body condition score?
And that's where we need the picture of them coming in and then a picture a week later, right?
And I always think of weather here, and in this area, we just had, 12 foot of snow here in Laramie last week almost. And what is the weather? Is it hot? I mean, that's also an extreme stress when it's really, really hot. My friend down at University of Florida, they've been 100 for how long?
Ooh.
stomping flies. And what is their next category? Looking at parasites.
Mm-hmm.
What is their health going into it? Overall health, specifically their parasite load. And again, I bring back to attention our mouth and dental care.
Big one. Yep.
So some very specifics again, and this Jenny started talking about this also. So we talked about our feed stuffs. We talked about the different factors that affect how we feed them. So these are some basic guidelines for the horse. We want that gradual change in their diet. So increasing grain, increasing hay, changing grain, or changing your hay. If you can, to your best ability, try to keep a couple bales. When it get low, then call for the new load and try to mix the old bales with the new bales to try to be consistent.
And it's not a hard adjustment.
Yep.
And so if I start feeding grain when I wasn't feeding grain, I don't go out there and give them a whole, grain bucket full. I might give them just the bottom layer.
Yeah, and I kind of will go around about a pound a day to add it, a half a pound to a pound a day. Some horses are more sensitive, but I wouldn't add more than that a day. Your typical, it depends on your feed stuff, but in general, kind of your big square scoop for feed. Does that make sense what I'm talking about, Jeremiah?
Yep. The big, what you'd buy at the normal feed store. They have the feed scoop that's right next to the grain bin.
Your grains in general are going to weigh, and this is really oversimplifying it, they're going to be around 4 pounds.
So a quarter of that scoop per day.
Yep. That's just a scenario because we're like, oh, we'll just give them a scoop today. You're actually adding about 4 pounds. Oats are going to be a little less. Corn's going to be more. Your sweet feed's going to fit right around that 4 to 5 pounds in one scoop a day. I wouldn't add a full scoop in one day.
Yep. So spread that increment out over a week if you can, blending that hay when you get new feed stock, even grain, that kind of thing. Yep. Okay.
And as we go down, looking again, we already said the 1 to 1.5% of body weight, but another rule of thumb along with that is going to fit into a minimum of a 50% ration as roughage. It's really tough to safely feed a horse at that 50%. 50% concentrate and 50% roughage. You can do it, but you're going to have to be very meticulous and careful about it. And that would be in our pretty high energy, high stakes environments with like a young racing horse or young performance horse.
So that's the bare minimum. I would not want to get out of 50% of roughage, and probably more likely a 60 or 70% would be adequate for most of us, unless you're in those high performance situations, what you're saying. And
Yep.
So that's 50% or 60%, whatever you're saying of roughage, that's on a per day basis.
Yep.
Okay.
And general rule of thumb for your general horse, 75, you want to stay around the 75% roughage and up to 25% grain or concentrate. That's
Great.
Still a pretty high amount of grain.
Still a lot. Yeah.
When we look at feeding this concentrate, when we feed the grain or the concentrate, it does cause a change in the pH in the stomach specifically, and also throughout the digestive tract. We're going to focus on the stomach here, just because it relates highly to ulcers. So we want to minimize big loads of concentrate as much as we can. So we don't want to feed much more than the 0.75% of body weight at one feeding. So if you have that young horse, you're behind on weight, you want to push them hard, try to break the feedings up into multiple small feedings throughout the day so we don't have a big change in pH. Being acidic stomach, and acidic stomach is going to lead them or possibly lead them to having stomach ulcers. They're very hard to manage and very expensive to treat.
Great. So you have on here, check your water, and that's a great picture. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen a horse dunk its head in a tank of water that deep before, but I definitely get mine where they get their nostrils under there and blow some bubbles and whatnot and throw their head around. and then provide salt and mineral block. Is there anything particular there on the mineral block?
You want to be very careful with your supplementation. I'll say I prefer to always have free choice salt. That's always going to, yes, technically your sweet feed or whatever you're feeding may be balanced for what they need for salt. You always have a variation in your hay, whether it's the bale in the pile or what cutting you got. So I have free choice salt available, just a white salt block, and then a true mineral block. There's a big difference in an iodized mineral block, kind of the red ones you would see at the feed store that cost, I don't know, maybe around $8, $10. That's not truly a mineral block. It is still 98% salt. Most case scenarios, the horse cannot physically consume enough of that mineral block to meet their mineral needs. So if that's what you have out to complement your pasture forage only diet, your chances are throughout the year you're not always going to meet your mineral vitamins and mineral requirements. So having the mineral block, they're going to be truly minerals. They will have some salt because that limits the intake in them, so the horse doesn't eat them like candy. They're more expensive, so therefore you don't want them to eat them like candy. They're going to be more around the $20 to $25 range. So those are a few markers to tell the difference in your blocks.
Is there a block I don't want to feed my horse?
Well, specifically with your blocks, you're going to have to be careful with your grass, what's your selenium level. You're going to have to be careful with that, depending on your pasture. One thing for supplementation to stay away from with a cattle pasture, a sheared cattle pasture, would be any type of growth promotants like Rumensin, Bovatec, any ionophore, which is typically going to be more in a cake or a tub form. You really kind of want to stay away from those with horses because they're toxic to horses.
So you want to find a block that's labeled for horses and stay away from a cattle block. So just because I'm throwing blocks out for cattle does not mean my horse is covered and maybe should not even have access to it.
And so will a block actually have a label on it that shows the different mineral contents, or a safety data sheet or something like that that'll come with it that you can see what's in it?
Yes, at most commercial feed stores, they have them on there. Sometimes they do get ripped off. That's a great point. Sure. They get ripped off in handling, but they should all have some kind of label on them to tell you what's in them.
Great. What else?
Another big common question and or mistake or problem I see is the coffee can method or the big plastic scoop that we talked about. We really want to kind of stay away from, like, if we're going to change a feed. This is a common scenario that I hear all the time, like, oh, my horse is 12 years old or 15 years old. My horse isn't keeping weight like I would like as much. Maybe I'm going to try a senior feed. So they change from, let's say, 4 pounds of a sweet feed to 4 pounds of a senior feed. But if you look at the label, the senior feeds typically are higher in fiber. If a feed is higher in fiber, it is lower in energy. And then it's the opposite with the sweet feed. The sweet feed actually is typically higher in energy, but lower in a fiber. So less energy or less calories. So you actually just took your horse from 4 pounds of a higher energy feed to 4 pounds of a lower energy feed.
So you're actually doing the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish.
You're actually doing the opposite and being very diligent and paying attention to the recommended feeding amount on that feed tag. Some senior feeds are going to say you need to start feeding or work your way up to 8 pounds of feed instead of the recommended daily feeding being 4 pounds. So doing the straight coffee can doesn't work, and specifically with a coffee can, and let's talk whole grains. If you want your horse to gain some weight and they've been eating oats and you would say, well, I've got some corn here handy, maybe I'll switch them to corn, and you went from having a coffee can 4 pounds of oats to like a 6 pound can with a much higher energy corn, that you're going to probably have some digestive issues because the corn is going to be lower in fiber and higher in energy.
Right.
You can use the coffee can, but first you need to figure out how to recalibrate it, right? How much do I need in that coffee can with this new type of feed? Is that correct?
Exactly. So you don't want to switch cold turkey. You want to blend the oats and the corn, or the senior and the sweet feed, or whatever it is, blend them gradually over 7 to 10 days to get that new concentrate. That's what I mean, the concentrate with the coffee can.
Yep.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a really
Yep.
good.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification, Jenny. Great. So what else do we need to think about? I think we've talked about the difference of horses, the difference of the age, different of size, talked about body conditioning, talked about how to balance that ration as we're kind of going through in a general census. We haven't got in too deep. So what's next then?
Some things on this one before I click over. Horses are very sensitive with their digestive tract compared to cattle. So we really want to be free of mold to stay away from toxins. And then I like Jeremiah kind of alluded to this with our pastures, we don't always fence off our pastures or have different paddocks or bring them in every night or turn them out every morning. To watch for those feeding behaviors. Horses have a dominance hierarchy for their natural behaviors. That's be sure that you might have to bring that young horse in and feed it by itself if there's a boss mare out there not letting them eat.
Especially if they're at a feed bunker or something like that, where it's limited forage availability.
Yep, at a feed bank forage, and then also your concentrate, trying to throw it in the bottom of the pan or a couple buckets. And always a recommendation for feeding multiple horses in a pen is try to have multiple feeders and put them in a triangle shape instead of in a square. Squares have corners and they can back each other into corners and start having little arguments and disputes over who gets what feed. So a triangle arrangement is recommended for the horses to less likely to fight over it. They can keep moving round and round. And it's really with horses, typically, here we go again, typically, they don't turn down feed when they're in a confined scenario. When we watch for a refusal of feed, usually there's something wrong. And that's the first thing I'm going to say. That's why I put it in this order. If you have a bunch of feed left over from the night, the day, whatever it may be, go look at your water and make sure that it's clean. The water is going to drive their feed intake.
So if they're not drinking enough, then they're not going to eat enough. And if you have, for 4 days, they've cleaned up all their hay, but today they didn't clean up their hay, something's up. Okay.
And check with your tank heaters. We have to use tank heaters a lot. Just double check, that it's clean, that it doesn't smell. They have a very, very, very acute sense of smell, and that there isn't something going on with your hot water heater. Either it's too hot or some kind of electrical circuit going on.
There you
The
go.
electrical short in the water system is always a bad thing.
Never good for anyone. So oh yeah, perfect. So we're going to get to now pastures, right? And turning them out to the pasture. When is a good time to turn them out to pasture? There's a lot of, different opinions on this one.
And we talked about this a little bit earlier too. It kind of depends on where you're at and how your pastures are doing. There's different topics and shows that they've talked about not overgrazing your pasture. You don't want to turn out your horse too early so that they overgraze and stunt the growth. But then also we want to gradually turn them out as the grass is maturing. We want to the younger horses are going to be really, really high, or the younger grasses are going to be really high in a specific ingredient called fructans. So those can cause problems with the horse we'll talk about later. So we'll have a couple tips on that. Regionally, it depends on how your pasture is doing. You want it to be relatively well established before you turn them out so that you don't stunt the growth on it. Is that adequately said from a pasture management?
Yep. Yeah, no. Yeah, you definitely want to be sensitive to when you turn those horses out on that grass, because you can stop the productivity of that pasture and that. So yeah, no, I think you nailed it.
And I keep coming back again to kind of the evolution and the behavior of the horse. So their digestive system is different, as we talked about, because they're not really a ruminant like a cow that would sit and ruminate. And they're not really only a monogastric, which is a stomach only. So like us, they fit in between. So we have to balance their nutrition to treat them like both.
And so that pasture could be meeting their nutritional demands at certain times of the year, but then at other times of the year, it might not be meeting it. And at certain points, right, maybe early in the spring is probably the most likely, it's exceeding their nutritional needs or demands.
And even within exceeding their nutritional demands, we don't want them to get too fat on it right away. But the main ingredient when we're turning out that we want to be concerned about is that the fructans. So we want to be pretty cautious about that. Is highly concentrated in our early grass, and that can cause problems in the digestive tract of the horse, that specific ingredient. They kind of fall into the category of the non-structural carbohydrates. And that's also why we want to be careful when we start introducing grains. The grains are going to relate more to the starches that cause these problems, but the fructans with the early grass. So we want to be cautious in turning our horses out. So then we feel conflicted, like I want the horse to gradually introduce its diet as the hay gradually comes on. But then are we going to overgraze our pasture and do damage? And then also when we have big temperature swings, like a nice week, and then we have a really cold night, it actually increases the level of those non-structural carbohydrates in our young grasses. So overnight, literally your feed stuff's just changed on you.
It's hard to regulate and hard to balance in a pasture situation, essentially. Yep.
Yeah.
And so if we get too much of this, those fructans or those sugars that you're talking about, those carbohydrates, what can happen? What is our concern with that with our horses?
That can lead to laminitis. It causes, this is oversimplifying, but it causes an inflammation in the horse. Specifically, we're going to have some inflammation and decreased blood flow to the horse's feet. They have some laminae that actually connect the hoof wall. Laminae are some soft tissue that blood runs through to connect the hoof wall to a bone, the coffin bone inside of the hoof. So they're connected by that blood flow, the laminae there. And when we have a toxin, we have inflammation, and then we don't have adequate blood flow in and out of the hoof. And then they start to die, the laminae die, and the severe problem is that hoof or the hoof and the coffin bone will actually move away from each other. And then it can...
That hoof wall will separate off in severe cases, and that coffin bone will drop away from the hoof wall, and they will no longer be connected. And in severe cases, you might not be able to get them to reattach, correct?
Yep, and it's extremely painful in the horse. It's very easy to see it. They don't want to walk. Their feet really, really hurt. Their hooves really hurt. So I kind of described this in general words on what happens to the hoof during this high level of the sugars.
So you're going to see the horse get bigger, right? They're going to get fatter essentially with more of these carbohydrates if they don't have the exercise to burn that calorie load. And then they might start becoming tender-footed, real soft-footed as they're moving around.
Yeah. And if you have a really severe case and a big load, in a couple of days, your horse can go without changing body condition, score, or weight very much. In a couple of days, they'll be tender-footed, and then sometimes even overnight, they'll be lame the next morning.
So it's not a sudden. It is a gradual progression. However, that progression can be short-term in terms of it's not going to take months or years. It's going to take weeks or a few days, right? But it's not going to be they're fine today, tomorrow they're not.
Yep, they're gonna have a gradual kind of degradation of that laminae. And you may not be able to, like, we can't see inside the horse's hoof. And I really like that you said that. It's not very smart for a horse, evolutionary, right, for them to show signs of weakness. they evolved to hide their lameness and hide problems in order to not be the last one in the pack. So they have a very high pain tolerance, and they tend to hide their soundness issues until it's been pretty substantially going on.
Because in the origin perspective, right, the evolution of the horse, the weak member of the herd ran out of the herd or kicked out of the herd or left.
Yep, or they were the first one that the predator went for.
Right.
They're the easiest game.
You had some pictures of laminitis, did you not?
Yep. Oops, we'll go here. Again, I had a couple, just some more information specifically about laminitis and what it is. It's commonly called founder, grass founder, and the condition itself isn't specifically just to grass related. We talked about overfeeding, some of the other kind of causes that we can relate it to. Digestive upset, which is a big term for colic in the horse. And is there any kind of toxin? So maybe a mold or something else in the feed. Do they severely colic? Do they have a retained placenta? So that's when a mare delivers a foal and part of the placenta stays inside of the mare. It's not delivered or expelled from the mare. You can also have it from excessive concussion on the feet of the horse. So a couple of different causes. The physiology behind it of what happens to the lamini and the blood flow is there, all the same, but the cause can be different.
Gotcha. What caused that blood flow to decrease? Yep. Well, great. I think we've covered it. This has been outstanding, Jenny. Anything else?
No, this was such a big topic. It was really hard to kind of narrow it down here as we go through. I realized as we started talking, I was like, wow, there's so much to talk about.
We threw a lot in here. This has been a long, lengthy discussion. It's been great. I got a question for you. Sorry, Jeff.
No, just thank you for providing the information, Jenny.
So I have a question. So if I had an older horse, let's say he's 14, 15 years old, gelding, and I throw him out in my pasture in the wintertime and I feed him solid alfalfa, just high quality alfalfa, is there a chance of founder and he's not being exercised?
That could be in the first, alfalfa is one of the hottest topic in horse diets. Some love it, some hate it. The first thing that jumped to my mind, you said a 15-year-old horse. I thought, oh, that's a senior horse. We need to be careful feeding alfalfa.
Why is that?
They have a hard time with their calcium. They have more calcium buildup because they have a harder time excreting calcium. And in general, alfalfa is going to have higher calcium than a grass hay. So you're a little bit predisposed to having some kidney stones even in that horse. So I try to stay away from alfalfa with older horses in general. Calorically, when we look at the calories, with high quality grass hay and a high quality alfalfa, the calories aren't going to be that different. Your crude protein is going to be that different. And an older horse doesn't necessarily, depending on their use, really need a high protein diet. And they have a harder time excreting excess protein as urea through the kidneys. Their kidney function starts to go down as they get older. So that to me went, oh, why are we doing that? Do we really need to do that?
Gotcha. Okay. And so it's just that belief of, a lot of times we think the 25-year-old horse is the senior horse, not our 15-year-olds, right? They're in their prime. They're excellent. They can have anything. They go and work all day. But really, once we start hitting 15 to 18 years old, they're becoming a senior horse and need to be adjusting that nutritional need down that way, right?
And alfalfa can be a really, really good feed. So if you just have to balance your concentrate carefully when you have more alfalfa.
Great. Well, what else? What have we not talked about? Jeff, any thoughts or questions? I don't have any questions in the chat box.
I like your tips here for doing spring turnout, because that was the one question I still had, was if you had suggestions for how to ease that transition onto pasture without causing problems.
I think one of the most common tips we forget is feed them before you turn them out.
Fill them up, right?
Fill them up with hay. Fill them up with hay before you turn them out, and they're less likely to consume as much. It's kind of like us if you have a small snack before you go to the buffet.
you don't tend to eat the whole buffet. I like
Stuff them
that.
first and then turn them out.
Great. Well, again, Jenny, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for bringing us this topic. It has been just absolutely wonderful. And again, we're just going to, we have recorded this, so we're going to post it back up there. But hopefully in the near future, we're going to continue doing this as our plan. And so hopefully we can bring you back on some other topics in that. So that's been fabulous. Jenny, if you wouldn't mind sharing our Barnyards and Backyards website, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. We talked about a lot of things. Jenny shared a few things, few publications in the chat box. Those links, we're going to also upload those links into the Barnyards and Backyards website. So if you want to know more about the Barnyards Backyards live shows, we still have our schedule up there, so check into that. We post this recording and all the other shows we've done. We post them back on this website, and then we link that to those links in there as well. So it's an easy one to find, one-stop shop for you. Also, search that Barnyards Backyards website. It is just a plethora, a treasure trove of information for everyone on various topics of your land management, plant management, gardening, livestock, as we talked about today with horses and that. Then the other thing is, Jenny mentioned, reach out to your county extension offices. We have an office in every county of the state and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation, and they have some resources or at least have information or can connect you to members of the rest of our university down on campus, such as Jenny. And so they can be there and help you and answer those questions. So reach out. This URL that Jenny Thompson is sharing is where you'd find those county extension offices. Very simple. The last thing is, Jenny shared the evaluation link in the comments section here in Zoom and also on Facebook. And so if you have a few minutes, we really appreciate the feedback. It really helps us guide this show and make it hopefully more beneficial for you. For those of you in Zoom, once you close out, you've probably done this before, but you're prompted in a URL or in an internet browser with that evaluation automatically. So if you can take a few minutes, give us a shout out. We really appreciate it. Again, thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny, again for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks a lot.